two, one, two, three.
Hello and welcome to Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. I'm here today with Eli Friedman, a professor in the Cornell Industrial and Labor Relations School. We're going to be talking about China. Among the baby boomers, quite a few leftists were Maoists. They admired China. Is China still a model for communism? And perhaps take it from there.
Yeah, the short answer is China is not a model for communism today, and I think that there's a question about whether it was in the 1950s and 60s. Though, the first thing I want to say is that I'm sympathetic to that perspective for many baby boomers. My mom herself identified as a Maoist in the 1960s and 1970s, and so it's a position that I understand well. I think there's a couple components to this. The first thing that we have to try to understand is what is it that people in, university students in the United States or in France who really took to Mao, what it was about the Chinese Revolution that appealed to them, and then how it actually got used in a Western context. And I think if you look at what did Maoism mean to, say, a university student in America or France or other places in the West, it was really a way of thinking about challenging authority relations within universities, within higher education, within established bureaucracies, political parties, within unions, and thinking about a kind of a radical form of democracy that sees kind of a critique of bureaucracy in essence as being central to politics, and in that sense also implies some sort of critiques of the Soviet Union, of Leninism, et cetera. So, I'm sympathetic to that. Maoism, of course, had even more profound influences globally in Latin America, in South Asia, in Africa, in inspiring rural-based revolutions rather than kind of waiting for the industrial proletariat to free all of society. And so, there's a lot of interesting and important dynamics there that were at play. Ultimately, I think for me personally, if you go back and look at what was actually happening in China, at least by the 1960s, a lot of the optimism of the revolution had already been kind of cast aside, and politics had kind of ensued in some not fantastic ways. That's a longer and complicated story. But the more important thing for understanding where China is at today is that after Mao died in 1976, you had a brief struggle over power, and then Mao's longtime nemesis, Deng Xiaoping, came to power. Mao had, had never liked Deng Xiaoping, and he had been put into exile 2 times. And Mao didn't like him because he thought he was going to take China on the capitalist road. Deng Xiaoping comes to power in 1978, and that's precisely what he does. And he does it by inviting in foreign capital, by privatizing state assets, not by fully privatizing land, but bringing in other essential elements of a capitalist society, such that there's no question that today China is a capitalist society. It's part of global capitalism, and it is in fact the second biggest global capitalist power in the world after the United States.
Going back to history a bit, I guess even in communist China's heyday, Hong Kong was the exception. But how did that change?
Yeah. So, Hong Kong was never an important city in Imperial China. In the last dynasty, it was the Qing Empire, and the British signed an agreement which gave Hong Kong Island over to the British Empire, became a colony. Subsequently, they also ceded the Kowloon Peninsula, which is just across the water from Hong Kong Island. And in 1898, they signed a 99-year lease on the so-called New Territories. So Hong Kong, after that, has been under the control of the British up until 1997. And during the heyday of the Maoist period, it was an exception in the sense that it was under the control of the British. It was capitalist. It was never a full democracy. The British never allowed never allowed Hong Kongers to vote for the executive and only had very partial elections for the legislature. So in that sense, it wasn't certainly the worst colony, but there was in part because there was these kinds of political freedoms, civil rights that didn't exist in many other places, and there was definitely racism, things like that. But it was Hong Kongers in general are more nostalgic for colonialism than is the case for people in most places around the world. But Hong Kong was very outwardly focused during the period of the 1960s, 1970s. It was doing its own manufacturing and exporting those commodities to developed markets in Western countries and Japan. And aside from some kind of food, water, there was not a lot of trade that was happening between Hong Kong and China. There was some. But then after 1978, China begins to open to foreign investment, and Hong Kong becomes far and away the most important channel for private capital to come into China, into these burgeoning special economic zones. And so what we see is a lot of relocating of manufacturing from Hong Kong, also from Taiwan, other places in East Asia, and eventually the West, moving into China. And this provides a massive benefit to Hong Kong's capitalists. Of course, it leaves Hong Kong's workers in the lurch, and they have a really dramatic process of deindustrialization that happens in Hong Kong in the 1980s. So you have this kind of market-based integration between Hong Kong and China. And then in 1997, when Hong Kong reverts to Chinese rule, you can see that the chief executive, which is the name of the executive for Hong Kong post 1997, as well as the Legislative Council, it's not only that they want to prevent the development of democracy and to try to undermine some of the institutions that already existed in Hong Kong around elections, around freedom of press, freedom of speech, et cetera. They are doing that. But it is also a process that's really driven by a kind of a neoliberal logic, right? So Hong Kong after 1997 has all this outsourcing and privatization in the public sector that's going on. And Beijing really aligns itself with Hong Kong's capitalists, right? And this doesn't really serve the interest of workers in Hong Kong or workers in China. But Beijing does that because they recognize that those are the most powerful actors in Hong Kong society. And their top priority is to be able to control Hong Kong socially, politically, and eventually economically. So it is drawn much closer to China over the years, but it has done so on these kind of highly marketized terms.
In Hong Kong in 2019, there were popular uprisings, or apparently popular uprisings. It has been claimed that they were inspired by the US CIA. Is that a likely story?
No. I mean, conspiracy theories are popular and, of course, famously difficult to disprove, but there's no evidence that the CIA, in fact, orchestrated it. And if you think for just a moment about what happened in Hong Kong in 2019, when you had millions of people in the street, right? You have a single protest that had perhaps a quarter of the entire population of Hong Kong that was out there. The CIA is not capable of mobilizing 1.5 million or 2 million people into the streets at a single time. The CIA can do lots of things, but that's not one of it. More importantly, is it doesn't take seriously the very real grievances that Hong Kong people have been expressing for many years under both British colonial rule and after the handover in 1997, right? And those grievances are very real. And the grievances are political. Those grievances are also economic. If you look at the political grievances, in the Joint Declaration, so London and Beijing signed something called the Joint Declaration in 1984. This is between Margaret Thatcher and Deng Xiaoping. And what they do is they set the pathway for the transition for Hong Kong back to Chinese rule, which is going to happen after 1997. It leads to the formation of what's called the Basic Law, which is essentially the mini constitution for Hong Kong. And in that joint declaration, what they do is they promise that they're going to have direct election of the chief executive. In essence, a process, sort of universal suffrage and direct election. So a process of democratization, which is something that was, not surprisingly, very important to people in Hong Kong and something that they wanted. Again, the British never did this, right? So they don't have much of a high horse to be on with respect to the question of political democracy. But it was promised to people in Hong Kong. And it became quite clear after 1997 that Beijing was not going to follow through on that promise. And so Hong Kong people began mobilizing. And so we saw, especially from 2003 onwards, increasingly large and militant protests that were taking place in the streets 2003, there was a protest with 500,000 people. 2014 was the so-called umbrella movement, where you had four major occupations around the city demanding political democracy. And in 2019, you have this huge protest, which is around initially around a kind of an extradition law where Hong Kong wanted to be able to extradite criminals to China, which people were anxious about because China's court system is not particularly transparent or fair. But then it quickly became a protest both about political democracy, but equally important, and I think that this is something that can really resonate for Americans, it also became a protest against police brutality and police violence because essentially the state had decided that they couldn't solve the social problems that Hong Kong was experiencing. It has some of the highest inequality in the world, unaffordable housing, et cetera. That the state couldn't resolve those kinds of problems through political means. And so they were using police violence to try to repress people, right? And so you can see by the end of that movement in later 2019 and into 2020, in some ways, the most important demands that the movement was making was against police violence, right? And so just to come back to your original question,
Where else have we seen that?
Right. The CIA is not interested in fomenting movements against police violence. The CIA is perfectly happy to see state violence employed to repress popular movements. So, it's kind of an absurd proposition, but I think it is important to try to understand what really was motivating those protests.
Getting back to China itself, mainland China, is Chinese society egalitarian?
So you have a process beginning in the 1980s where China goes from being one of the most equal societies in the world to one of the most unequal societies in the world, right? Now, from the 1980s on, basically every country around the world is becoming more unequal. This is neoliberalism, right? This is true in the United States, it's true in Western Europe, it's true in East Asia, et cetera. The starting places, though, are different. And so one of the things that's pretty remarkable about China is in the 1970s and early 1980s, it is a very poor society, right, in general. There have been important advances in terms of health and education that happened under the Maoist government, but it's poor. That being said, it's quite equal, right? And so if you look at the Gini coefficient, right, which measures levels of inequality in society, it looks like a Scandinavian country, right? Sort of similar to Sweden. But then it accelerates this process of marketization later into the 1980s. And what you see is really one of the most spectacular increases in inequality ever recorded, right? So the inequality rate goes from around 0.3 something in the mid 1980s, and then rockets up to around 0.47 sometime in the middle of the 2000s. And the UN says that anything above 0.4 is considered quite dangerous. And so now China is about as unequal as the United States, which of course is one of the more unequal societies in the world. It's not quite as unequal as places like South Africa or Brazil, which are kind of the global champions, but it has increased quite dramatically, and the inequality occurs on a number of axes. It's definitely the sort of normal class-based inequality, right, where you have rich people that are getting richer and poor people who are not really advancing very much, if at all. You also have important kinds of regional inequalities. So you have the eastern part of the country, which has become quite rich, and the western part of the country, which has developed a lot in the last 15 to 20 years, but more slowly, and is generally not as wealthy. I think the more important form of inequality you have is between urban and rural areas. So rural areas have really been left behind, and the expectation is that people just move to cities to try to make more money. And then you also have ethnic inequality, right? Now, China, I think Americans oftentimes don't think of China as being a multi-ethnic society. It's like, well, everybody's Chinese. You have Han Chinese people, which are the majority, which constitute around 92% of the population. But that means that you have close to 100 million people who are ethnic minorities, or maybe more than 100 million people, just checking my math, who are ethnic minorities, right? So this is a large population, and this includes, I think, well-known groups like Tibetans, Uyghurs, Koreans, Mongolians, and then many other ethnic groups that Americans might be less familiar with. And in general, if you look at these ethnicities, they do not do as well as Han Chinese. In the kind of core part of China proper, in central China, this is not such a big issue because the overwhelming majority of people are Han. But if you go out to the peripheries, if you go out to Tibet, if you go out to Xinjiang, which is where Uyghur people are indigenous, then those kinds of ethnic differences become quite important and are an important basis of some of the social unrest that we've seen in those places in recent years.
Those differences are primarily ethnic, maybe religious, but not typically racial, as I understand it.
Yeah, it's complicated. It kind of depends on how you want to define a racial.
Well, that's true.
But so, for at least for Uyghurs and Tibetans, they are phenotypically distinct from Han people, especially Uyghurs. Han people can distinguish them, based on their looks. They tend to have, different kind of facial structure or, lighter hair. They can have green eyes. When I'm in China, people often ask me if I'm Uyghur, which I don't think I particularly look the part, but I think that particularly for Uyghurs and Tibetans, there is a kind of racialized difference. For most of the other minorities, it will be different, yeah, different languages, different religions, different kind of cultural practices, but not the kind of obvious racialized difference that we're familiar with in the United States.
In China, what is the role of government nowadays?
Yeah, and the role of government in terms of providing social welfare has changed a lot. Now, people might imagine that you have the Maoist period, state socialism, and this idea that the state just kind of has these centralized planners and they provide everything. And that's not actually really how it works. So even during the Maoist period, workers, social welfare for workers was provided through what's called the work unit system. So their employer, in essence, provided them the social welfare. They called it this kind of cradle to grave employment or social welfare. They would provide your housing, they would provide healthcare, schooling for your children, they would pay for your weddings, etc. So that's how it worked in urban areas. Rural areas, social welfare was provided by the commune, which was a collection essentially of many different villages together, and they would pool their resources to provide basic, but some kind of healthcare, certainly an improvement from what they had before, as well as education and things of that nature. So it's always been kind of a decentralized setup. But what happened during the period of marketization from the 1980s on is that those work units, those state-owned enterprises, many of them were privatized. And the ones that were not privatized, they had to shed those social welfare functions. And the communes were also undone, and land was distributed to individual families. And they could, within certain limits, kind of do whatever they wanted. But then the fiscal capacity of those communes to provide social welfare was also dramatically undermined. And so what you've seen over the process, really accelerating in the 1990s, but beginning in the 1980s, was a kind of migration of provision of social welfare from these work units and communes to individual cities. But there is still not really national level social welfare. So there's no, in the United States, you can think about the Social Security system, Medicaid, Medicare, these kinds of things, which are organized at the national level. They don't have that in China. The central government does provide some funding for pensions, not nearly enough. The pension system is quite weak. And they do provide some funding for healthcare, but it's organized at the level of essentially the prefecture, which is a sub-provincial unit. And that's really, really important to understand the organization of social welfare in China, because it means that different places have very, very different levels of social protections. So if you are in a place like Beijing, you have pretty good social services, right? You have decent schools, hospitals, the pensions are more generous, et cetera. It's not like a Scandinavian welfare state by any means, but it is relatively strong. If you're in a remote rural place in, say, Sichuan province, the government's fiscal capacity is much, much more constrained because they don't have big businesses, they don't have a big tax base, et cetera. And the central government engages in very little redistribution between places. So the kinds of education your child will get, kinds of pensions you'll enjoy will be much more constrained. And then the final point of this very decentralized system that they have that's quite important is that if you move from one place to another, you are not guaranteed access to the social services in those places. You have to, in essence, apply. So they have a kind of subnational citizenship regime. If you go from a rural area to a rich city, you can't just show up and enroll your child in school and enjoy the same healthcare as everybody else. You have to essentially apply, and they filter people out based on their perceived contribution to the local economy. So you have in China 300 million people which is a lot, living outside of their place of registration, which means they do not have that guaranteed access to social services. They're essentially falling through the cracks there. So it's a long way of saying that the government is doing lots of different things with respect to social welfare in China, but it's very geographically uneven, and it is frankly quite unequal as well.
We hear about the Belt and Road Initiative. What is that?
The Belt and Road Initiative was announced by Xi Jinping in 2013, and there's been a long process. I think there's debates about what exactly it is. I think oftentimes in the United States, it's depicted as this grand strategy to dominate the world. The Chinese government is maybe not doing itself any favors when it presents these maps that show all of their infrastructure kind of spanning the globe. And to a foreign audience, it kind of looks like they're trying to conquer the world. To a domestic audience, it plays really well because it's like, wow, China's doing all this great stuff overseas. So there's definitely some kind of miscommunication issues there. But the simplest way to think about the Belt and Road Initiative, I think of it essentially as a marketing strategy to try to create some coherence to the international investment activities of Chinese capital, and that capital can be state-owned or it can be private, and the government is providing certain kinds of incentives for that capital to go out of China, beginning really in the mid-2010s. There is a geopolitical component to it for sure, as is the case for any state when they send capital abroad. There's going to be political ramifications from that. They're going to, at a minimum, they're going to want to protect that capital. They're going to want to make sure that there's the security in place, that their investments are safe, et cetera. But it's not coordinated in the way that I think it is sometimes imagined to be, where you have this like central node in Beijing and they're kind of saying, okay, invest there, and we're going to create this like string of investments, which is going to allow us to dominate some sort of region. One of the things that's really driving the Belt and Road Initiative is the overcapacity that we've seen develop, particularly in China's manufacturing sectors, right? So by the mid 2010s, it's really apparent that China has just put too much investment, particularly in the production of steel and cement and all of this kind of heavy industry that is developing China's infrastructure and the real estate sector. As China needs less infrastructure because it's already made lots of investment, as the real estate sector begins to slow down, they've got all this capacity. And they're like, what are we going to do? Well, just like imperialist powers in the past in Western Europe and the United States, they export it overseas. They try to conquer new markets. And that's really the structural process that's driving the Belt and Road Initiative. It is also significant because as China has gone increasingly global, driven by these essentially market-based pressures, it's brought it into conflict with manufacturers and with corporations in other parts of the world, and also increasingly into conflict with the United States as the established imperial power.
As the established imperial power, the United States had a big economic meltdown in 2008. How did China react to that?
Yeah, well, it had a huge impact on China immediately. And this was a clear sign of how deeply integrated the two economies had become over the course of the 1990s and the 2000s. Keeping in mind, China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, and this was a signal to a lot of American corporations that it was now safe to really go all in on reorganizing their supply chains so that they were centered in China. If you think of the biggest American corporations of the era and up to the present, companies like Apple, especially Walmart, Amazon, later on Tesla, these kinds of companies couldn't exist in their present form were it not for the reorganization of their supply chains into China. They just couldn't operate on the same scale without China. So when the 2008 crisis started in the United States, the effect in China was really immediate. And so you saw just in the months after the crash that 20 million migrant workers in China in this export-oriented manufacturing sector lost their jobs and had to either go back home to the countryside, try to find employment elsewhere. So it was looking pretty dire, and the government was quite worried about this. And so the Chinese government took really decisive steps. This was organized at the central level. They took really decisive steps to intervene to try to stabilize the market. They had a stimulus package that was worth 586 billion US dollars, which in terms of a percentage of their GDP was much, much larger than the stimulus package that we had in the United States under Obama. What that stimulus package did, though, was, of course, they were unable to prop up those kind of export markets. That was a problem for the U.S. Europe, of course, had an even worse time coming out of the crisis. So those markets were proved to be less reliable than they had been for the previous 10 or 15 years. So a lot of that stimulus money went into investment in infrastructure. This is what we were just talking about a moment ago, into infrastructure and to real estate. And a lot of the investment in infrastructure was good and it was productive. China famously now has the world's largest high-speed rail network. The ports, the airports, the subway systems were all really dramatically modernized, and China has some of the best infrastructure in the world, and certainly much better than the United States in almost every respect. It also created a real estate bubble of, I think, unprecedented proportions and completely reorganized the production of various kinds of commodities around the world. It was powering copper extraction in Peru. It was powering new industries in iron ore extraction in Australia. And there was just an unbelievable real estate bubble, which created fabulous wealth, particularly for real estate developers and for people who happen to get into the real estate market at the right time. And Chinese people have a disproportionate amount of their wealth in real estate. More than 70% of household wealth is in real estate in China. But as in other places, when you have a real estate market, there are winners, but there's also losers. And so the losers creates a kind of a generational divide for the younger people who did not get into the real estate market and later were going out and trying to buy a house in a city and finding that they could not buy a house because of this real estate bubble. It made it much too expensive. So you have many more people living with their parents. And if you look at a kind of income to real estate ratio, which is a way of understanding locally how expensive real estate is, Chinese cities are among the worst in the world. Hong Kong is, I think, famously the worst real estate market in the world, but places like Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing also have some of the worst income to real estate price ratios anywhere in the world. And so it's put real estate out of reach for many people. So again, this stimulus kept economic growth going. Employment did not collapse. They didn't have the deep crisis that we had in the US or in Europe, but it came at a cost, and they're now paying the cost for that overinvestment in real estate in many ways.
Well, thank you, Eli Friedman. This has been a very interesting view on China, which I must say a lot of us knew very little about until now.
Thanks. Yeah, it's been my pleasure. China's big and complicated, but I think important.
This has been Ithaca DSA Presents. I'm Theresa Alt. Thanks for watching.
1, 2, 1, 2, 3.